ongoing. But we've got our second guest on hold waiting for us. So as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, we have Yoni Michanie. He works for the organization CAMERA, that's all caps CAMERA. He is a campus advisor and strategic planner. So in essence, he's got students, fellows underneath him. So, one of the reasons why I want to talk with him is there was this article written by a young student. She's an Iranian Jew. Her family were refugees. They came here to escape the Islamic Revolution in Iran. A student at the University of California, San Diego. She wrote a nice piece this week, and I had a chance to chat with her. She's one of Yoni's fellows, but they talk so much about, and really what they're dealing with and addressing on campus, the extreme anti-Semitism, whether it's by SJP or other groups, that's occurring on college campuses and ostracizing and intimidating Jewish students. So really excited to have Yoni on with us. Yoni, are you there?
Yoni?
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. We really appreciate you taking the time. So did a brief introduction of you, but one of the things that, obviously we want to talk with you about is your oversight of college campuses. You and I spoke the other day, and I know that you from California to Florida, you help out with college students and fellows and help train them to be advocates when they're dealing with anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism. And you've had some personal experiences yourself, including here in Florida. So why don't you tell our listening audience a little bit about yourself, maybe your experience at University of Florida?
Sure, absolutely. So again, thank you so much for having me on. I have to tell you, I joined the team at CAM about 2 years ago, and I've been working with these very two different regions, the West Coast and Florida. So one of the things is the West Coast really served as the launching point for institutionalized anti-Zionism on college campuses. And so on the West Coast, my efforts have been sort of fighting back years of antagonizing Jewish and pro-Israel students on campuses. And when I started working on Florida campuses, the environment had not really so much to do with the West Coast. What we saw actually was a lot of apathy. Either people didn't care about the subject matter, or Jewish students and pro-Israel students felt rather comfortable on their campuses. Tampa, for particular reasons, served as an exception to this, but for the large part, campuses like the University of Miami, Florida International University, the University of Central Florida, Florida State University were pretty much removed from this particular subject matter. And these past few months, I would say even the past year, we've seen a huge change in that particular respect. And one of those changes I felt for myself when I was invited to speak at the University of Florida, where I was protested by nearly 100 students before I could even finish the first sentence of my speech.
Were you able to finish and give the speech, or did they disrupt it so much that you couldn't even talk?
So luckily I have experience with this, so naturally my instinct as they were standing on tables and waving Palestinian flags and very disturbing signs, I invited them to stay and that they could challenge me on any point that they thought would be inaccurate or inconsistent. And of course, they refused, as happens in most occasions, unfortunately. But luckily, there were about 35 or 40 students who decided to stay and listen to the presentation, which went on. And, interestingly enough, this whole thing floated on social media and articles back and forth that I had with the school newspaper. But I actually had a few students that participated in the protest message me saying how much they regret their actions and that they wish they could have at least heard what I'd come to say.
That's really interesting. That I wish they had stayed and listened to you. I think you obviously your background. I know that you had talked with me about the fact that obviously you had served in the IDF, and in that you had done a lot of humanitarian work with Syrian refugees. and just having that dialogue about what's going on and letting them challenge you. I think that's probably what you expect to see more in the West Coast is sort of this intolerance. So I'm happy to hear that you had that. I mean, have they at least started to engage in dialogue with you, or no?
Yes. There is a positive light to this, that a lot of the times dialogue does break out. And one of the things that we do at Camera is not only teach our fellows or our student groups the facts, but we help them develop communication skills, because the conversation is only going to go as far enough as the two parties involved want it to go. And a lot of the times that doesn't just fall to objective truths, it falls under the likability of the person delivering the message. And so we really do work on that with our fellows. And I'm happy to report that in a lot of instances, we're able to have very meaningful conversations. But I remember after the incident, I published a piece in the Daily Wire, and one of the things I remember saying, and I feel so strongly about, is that the conviction of these protesters wasn't shown by their decision to march out before I had completed my first sentence. Their conviction would have been proven had they stayed, listened to everything I had to say, and still their ideals remain.
Mm-hmm. And then they could discuss it. Having a conversation clearly is a much better way to go than just having a protest where both sides get to put their ideas forth. You know, we've had problems here at USF, the University of South Florida here in Tampa. Some kids have told us that they're afraid on campus, which is just... That's just so disappointing. What advice do you give to students who are on campuses and confronted by people who are anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, and just full of hate? What do you tell these students?
I tell my students that I served in the Army, I wore a uniform, I served in Israel's most volatile borders, and I'm back doing the same thing. Wearing a different type of uniform. And I remind my students that this is no longer Poland 1939. This is not Hitler's Europe where Jews have to march with their head down and guns pointed at our backs, and following blind destruction. No, those times are gone. This is a time where Jews can stand strong, where Jews can stand with resolve, when the Jewish state is flourishing. And this is a time where Jews will no longer apologize for who they are. Neither will pro-Israel students, and we will stand strong with resolve, with our heads held up high, and we will defend our values, no matter on which side of the political spectrum. You want to be a conservative and a Zionist, you can do that. You want to be a progressive and a Zionist, you can do that. You never have to compromise your political philosophies for the sake of supporting Jewish rights of self-determination.
That's such a strong, powerful message. And I know when we have Bianca Kermani, the student fellow at the University of California, San Diego, on in a few weeks, we'll talk about that because she's a progressive and she felt like she was being ostracized by so many of the progressive student organizations because she was also a Zionist. But one of the things that you told me that was interesting at the University of Florida, so this, I guess your speech was occurring the week that the last time we had 400 rockets come in from Gaza into southern Israel up to Tel Aviv, that the students actually went outside when they left, when the 100 students walked out of the protest, that they went outside and had a vigil for the Islamic Jihad that was launching those rockets into southern Israel.
Mm-hmm. So, I think that's a very relevant point, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I'll say this. The IDF is the most moral military in the world. No other army ever puts its soldiers at risk to save civilian sides on all sides of the fighting. No other military does that to the extent that the Israeli Defense Forces does. And so, while the situation is unfortunate and there are going to be civilian casualties, disproportionately, you will see that the casualties in the Gaza Strip are from Palestinian terror or militant groups, such as Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And before I had come to speak at the University of Florida, the IDF had done a surgical strike with no civilian casualties to eliminate one of the heads of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who was responsible for, in the span of, I believe, 2 weeks, firing nearly 400 indiscriminate rockets at civilian areas in southern Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of my speech was going to address that. And as these protesters left, they held a vigil for all Palestinians who had passed away at the hands of Israel's retaliation for these 400 indiscriminate rockets, which a disproportionate number of them were militants or terrorists of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But the problem goes even further. See, it's not just about the protesters, it's about how the school newspaper, The Alligator, decided to cover it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the first article, which was filled with erroneous claims, despite the fact that I gave them a full interview after my speaking engagement, they decided to call Abu al-Ata, who was the commander of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who was surgically basically striked by Israel.
Oh, my God.
They labeled him as a Palestinian militant.
Well, not a terrorist.
Not a terrorist.
Right. Wow.
So did the Alligator correct? I assume you went back to him and said, "Whoa, folks, there's all these inaccuracies." Did they run a correction?
Well, we tried, and so they didn't do that correction. I believe, actually, if you go into the article, even now, you'll see that Abu al-Ata is still described as a militant. I try to have conversations with the journalists. I even wrote my own response in the Daily Wire addressing some of these inaccuracies. But to be honest, there were so many of them that just one article as a response wasn't enough.
Wow.
And this is the problem that we're facing on many college campuses. We work beyond the U.S. We also work in Canada. And so I can tell you that McGill, the University of McGill in Canada, for example, the school newspaper, the McGill Daily, has a policy that they will not publish a single piece that supports the Jewish right to self-determination.
Wow.
We ran a couple of things the past couple of weeks about anti-Semitism at McGill University. There's been all sorts of problems at that particular university.
There sure has. I mean, there is just so much to talk about. And we really appreciate you being on to have this dialogue. I'm really surprised and just sort of speechless, really, about the Alligator, the reports. Even Hamas to a certain extent considers the Palestinian Islamic Jihad to be terrorists. So it just really questions sort of these students and how they're being informed or misinformed, and this concept of anti-Zionism that is so prevalent on college campuses that would allow a college reporter to take that position and call a terrorist and get a quote from them.
And this is the reality we face because, it starts in the Alligator in a college newspaper where you'll say, oh, the audience isn't that big. But then you open up the front page or the opinion pages of the New York Times, and they continue to publish pieces which omit the word terrorism when describing the activities of Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas. And so we're really seeing this work all its way up. I mean, college and high schools are where these students are learning the principles and values of journalism.
Right.
And if we don't address it here, by the time they reach employment in the New York Times or the Washington Post, when they decided to call the leader of ISIS an austere religious scholar, we can
laugh, but it's not funny.
It's just so ludicrous that it makes you laugh. I wonder. We're talking about these college students. A kid doesn't come to college as a freshman and go, "I am going to be anti-Israel." Do you know where the source or how this develops and how they mold the minds of the kids that are taking part in these protests?
Sure. And that's a great question. It's a science that we continue to figure out. But when I come into a college campus, I work under a principal law, which I call the 10-10-80, which means 10% of the students, because they're Jewish or because they're passionate Zionists, will already have an inclination to support Israel. The other 10%, for whatever background, whatever they're coming from, have an inclination to not support the state of Israel. And 80% of the student body is either not sufficiently informed to make a decision or they're apathetic. They're engineering majors, they're physics majors. They really have other things to worry about. And that's usually the crowd that we try to target. However, we don't give up on the 10% that has anti-Israel tendencies. And I can tell you that, these numbers usually change against our favor, mostly because of intersectionality.
Sure. And that's the progressive issue that I know Bianca has been facing, that the student that we'll talk with in a couple of weeks. Absolutely.
Right. Which at the core of it is completely false, because I remember being on a college campus where there was actually a student group that had registered that was called Queers for Palestine. Now, the interesting thing is that it's illegal against the law, death penalty.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
In the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip.
And that many, by the way, many in the LGBTQ community in the West Bank, for instance, will try to seek refuge in Israel to save their lives, because that is a fact that they are killed. I mean, in so many of those countries, it's intolerant. I mean, you even had, Iran, the supreme leader regularly hangs men in the square in Tehran that are accused of being homosexual. So it's really, I mean, and that's the absurdity of it, right? Like, it's like, no, actually, don't you get it? If you were there, that you'd be killed and ostracized. So, well, anyway, but we got to wrap up. And we obviously love talking with you, Yoni. And so we'll love to have you back on maybe in the near future to continue the dialogue. And so everyone listening, again, that was Yoni Michanie with the organization Camera. He is the campus advisor and strategic planner. We so enjoyed having you on today. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoni.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.
I look forward to being on again.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I just wonder how they mold.